For antiwar.com and Chaos Radio 95.9 FM in Austin, Texas, I'm Scott Horton, and this is Anti-War Radio. Well, the United States has reached an agreement with North Korea. It looks like the crisis of the Korean Peninsula, as it's been known for the past few years, is finally over. But when I open the New York Times and the Washington Post to try to figure out exactly what happened, I have to say the reporting leaves quite a bit to be hoped for. So luckily for me, I'm acquainted with Dr. Gordon Prather from antiwar.com. Welcome, Dr. Prather.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, Dr. Prather is a nuclear expert. He spent his entire life in the Navy working at the Lawrence Livermore and Sandia National Laboratories, advising senators, has vast experience in these matters, understands the intricacies of these sort of international negotiations and so forth. So he's always a great person to turn to for explanations of things such as this. Let's go ahead and start with the problem of the media there. Dr. Prather, why is it that I can't just open the New York Times and find out from these people what's going on without getting an email from you 3 or 4 minutes later saying, geez, would you look at these guys and how many things they got wrong in here?
Yeah, I even give you some names. At the New York Times, it's Sanger, and then there's a guy named Michael Gordon, who was a compatriot of Judith Miller. And you kind of wonder if these people ever bothered to read the, let's say, the UN resolutions, which are in English, you know. They could read them.
Yeah.
And they ought to be able to figure out or comprehend what they say. And presumably, Sanger and these other folks, Kessler at the Washington Post and others, and there are these people in the international arena. Charbonnet is with, Charbonnet's one, and he's either at Associated Press or Reuters. And there's a guy named George Jan, J-A-H-N, who's at the other one. Whichever one Charbonnet is not at, he's at the other one. And these people write all these articles that have, you know, they act like their articles were written by the White House press office. It's just an incredible thing.
Is it because they don't, I mean, you've been reading these people for a long, long time. Does it seem to you that they just don't have the discernment or the ability to comprehend? I mean, let's be honest, we're talking about nuclear issues, we're talking about, you know, complex international negotiations and things. Is it that they just don't understand in order to tell it straight to us?
Well, that is the most benign explanation I can think of, is that they're extremely stupid. Or it's conceivable that when Sanger wrote his article about this recent deal that supposedly took place in Beijing, that he has not actually read the details of the agreement.
Well, what did he get wrong in this case?
Well, I didn't even get through reading it all because both his piece and also the one by Kessler and others started out with the presumption, the basis, that the North Koreans had withdrawn from the agreed framework negotiated by Bob Gallucci during the Clinton era, 1994, 93, and 94, because the United States had discovered that the North Koreans were violating the agreed framework, and in fact had been almost from 1994 on conducting a secret, illicit, uranium-based nuclear weapons program. Now, there has been no evidence as of now yet that in all that period of time, from 1994 up until 2002, when George Bush unilaterally abrogated the agreed framework, that the North Koreans do have such a program. None. I've not seen the intelligence, so-called intelligence, because I don't have access to that, but they have shown this intelligence to the Chinese and to the Russians, and the Russians and the Chinese have dismissed it. Now, I don't know what it was, but the Chinese didn't believe it, and the Russians didn't believe it. So for Sanger to start out, let's talk about all of these so-called reporters who are apparently in the pocket of the White House press office. They just state this as a given, and they don't say, as all other reports do around the world, that there's no basis for it, that no one has ever shown that to be the case. In other words, George Bush, citing this unsubstantiated intelligence, broke off, unilaterally abrogated the agreed framework in October or maybe early November of 2002, and shut off the shipments of fuel oil to the North Koreans, which the agreed framework required as a condition for the North Koreans having frozen their nuclear programs, which there was no evidence at all that they were nuclear weapons programs, but they did have a reactor, a Russian, Soviet Union-supplied reactor, that could produce weapons-grade plutonium. And they agreed in 1993 to shut that thing down and put it under IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, lock and seal. And so far as I've been able to see from the pronouncements, the reports by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and from certainly the Chinese and the Russians and even the South Koreans have no reason to believe that the North Koreans did not faithfully comply with the agreed framework from 1994 all the way up through 2002.
Okay, now let me stop you right there just to kind of recap. What you're saying is, and this is all in the context of Sanger's so-called reporting at the New York Times, but basically the North Koreans had a deal that they made with the United States in the Clinton years, in 93, 94, that said, okay, you can have International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors in here, and we'll be a abiding member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, etc., as long as you give us fuel oil and light water reactors from Donald Rumsfeld's old company, and that kind of thing. And then Bush in 2002, on this accusation that, as you say, there's still no publicly produced evidence for whatsoever, and in fact no evidence that would satisfy any of our partner nations in the six-party talks, that North Korea had a secret program to enrich uranium. And based on that assertion without evidence, the United States, not the North Koreans, broke the deal. And it was then that they withdrew from the NPT, kicked out the IAEA, etc. And now, as the big breaking news is that we have a new deal with them. You're saying that you can't even get into the New York Times article past the first paragraph, where he reiterates the assertion of the Bush administration that they had a secret uranium enrichment program that still has not been proven.
That's right, and on the basis of what the White House, in the pocket of the White House press reporters in our country are saying, what they say about the deal, which, as I say, I have no idea whether or not Sanger and the rest of them have actually read this agreement, but other people have, and the rest of the world, the Russians and the Chinese and all that sort of thing, and they've written articles, I sent you one, I think, talking about the details of what, there's 5 negotiating groups set up, that involve the Chinese and the Russians and the South Koreans and all that sort of thing.
More promises of fuel.
What?
More promises of fuel shipments and such.
Oh, well, now let me get. I've lost the thread there. But the reason that we were going to give them fuel oil is the North Koreans claimed that the reactor that they agreed to shut down, the weapons-grade plutonium-producing reactor as a byproduct, was for generating electricity, and they had in the work a reactor they were building that was similar, that was 10 times the capacity, and they also agreed to cease construction on that one. And they said, well, what are we going to do, freeze in the dark? And so what the United States did was to broker a deal wherein the South Koreans, principally, and also the Japanese, would build replacement light water reactors that don't produce weapons-grade plutonium. And those reactors were supposed to have been online by 2003, is my recollection. That is, the agreement was signed in 1994. The construction was supposed to begin almost immediately, and those reactors were supposed to have been online by 2003. Well, then, when Bush came into as president in 2001, they really hadn't even begun constructing those reactors. Now, this is not the United States constructing these reactors. These were the South Koreans primarily. And basically, up until then, we had been supplying them fuel oil in lieu of those reactors that were shut down that would have been supplying electricity, allegedly. I don't know whether or not that's true or not. I don't know what their intentions are. I'm not a North Korean. But in any case, the Clinton administration had finally decided, okay, it looks like we're going to have to finally comply with the terms of this agreed framework of 1994. And so they had started all kinds of other things that were called for in that agreed framework. And among others was we agreed to begin negotiations with the North Koreans to establish eventually a peace treaty for the Korean War of 1950-51 and all that sort of thing, which is at present still in an armistice phase. There's never been a peace treaty for that war, 50-something years ago. Okay, then it was also supposed to lead eventually. The agreed framework said it would eventually result in full diplomatic relations, economic relations, and things of that nature with the United States. And so the Clinton administration, Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State, had begun saying, okay, it looks like we're going to have to honor this agreement after all, and they started this stuff, these bilateral agreements or negotiations and things of that nature. When Bush came in 2001, led by Bolton, basically, they essentially put the kibosh on all these initiatives by the Clinton administration. And that has been the reason for a lot of the Democratic Party opposition to what Bush has been doing with respect to the North Koreans. And it was certainly without any question whatsoever that the 1994 agreed framework, which apparently this new agreement that we are now entered into, which now also involves the Chinese and the Russians and maybe the Japanese. No, I think the Japanese are not involved in this. But the Russians and the Chinese are now also parties to this agreement, this agreed framework. And so it's not simply a matter anymore of us breaking off all this stuff. We would somehow or another have to get the Chinese and the Russians to stop this attempting to essentially bring an end to the Korean War of 1950 and to establish, bring North Korea back into a diplomatic and an economic entity.
So it looks to you then that this particular deal will make it more difficult for America to break it compared to the last one.
I don't see how we could break it now. And I also, one of the more hopeful things about the situation in Iran now, not Iraq, Iran, is that the Russians are building that reactor. And I don't think they're going to take kindly to either the Israelis or the United States bombing it just about the time they're starting to put fuel in it and killing a bunch of Russians and the IAEA safeguard inspectors that are on site and things of that nature. But that's what we keep threatening. We keep saying we're going to do that. No options are all options are on the table.
Wow, and Dr. Prather, I think that's a point that is very rarely brought up when people list the possible consequences of bombing that country, killing Russians and even International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors who are on site, and the repercussions from that.
Yeah, and also The Chinese are not involved anymore because we talked them out of it. They were going to supply a uranium conversion facility, but in 1997, Clinton talked them into canceling that. So the Iranians went ahead with the plans and the initial work that the Chinese had done and built their own facility. It doesn't work probably as well as it would have if the Chinese had built it, but that uranium conversion facility that converts yellow cake into uranium hexafluoride for introduction into gas centrifuges, that was to be a turnkey Chinese facility. But the Chinese have got other joint projects in Iran, including an LNG facility, which is not yet completed, of course, and a few other things like that. And if we go around trying to destroy Iran's capability to produce oil and gas, which is also one of the 300 or 400 or 700 targets that we're supposedly planning on taking out, we're going to kill a bunch of Chinese and destroy a bunch of their investment, billions of dollars of investment. But let's get back to North Korea. Okay, in my opinion, the Bush administration did what they did, abrogated the agreed framework, not because of anything for the alleged nuclear weapons program, because nobody really has expected the North Koreans to be capable of making nuclear weapons, even if they had the necessary weapons-grade plutonium. And on the basis of the one test that they've tried so far, they've made some progress, but they still haven't got it quite down yet to where they can make a 20 kiloton or 30 kiloton nuclear weapon. But that wasn't something that the Bush administration was particularly interested in my view. What they were unhappy with North Korea about, and the reason that Bush included them in the axis of evil in his 2002 State of the Union address, was because of the missiles, the ballistic missiles that North Korea was making and supplying to Iran.
Right. Although we saw what happened with their tests last fall, it doesn't seem like we have really too much to worry about with those.
Well, but the ones that Iran now has that are supposed they're not ICBMs. They can't threaten us. They probably couldn't even get to Europe, but they could get to Israel, and that's what bothers the people who seem to be running our government these days. Is that North Korea was supplying Iran not with nuclear weapons, but with missiles that were capable of reaching Israel. Mm-hmm. That's just an opinion.
Well,
and every time you read an agreement or a UN resolution about North Korea or about Iran that is supposedly about nuclear weapons, okay, there's always a very large section in there on missiles. And if you look at the most recent UN resolution with respect to North Korea, it's almost all about missiles. All of it.
Makes sense. And I guess they're worried about North Korea's ability to reach Japan in the event of a crisis on the peninsula there.
I don't know who's worried about that. The Japanese might be, but I doubt that they're very much worried about it. The Japanese occupied the Korean peninsula for, I don't even know, 50 or 60 years, something like that. And there's a lot of animosity still between those two peoples, let's put it that way. But I don't think, certainly the South Koreans don't think that the North Koreans are about to attack Japan.
Well, let me ask you your opinion on this. I've read before, and I wish I had a footnote handy for the reference or something, but I've read before that American policymakers had a real worry that North and South Korea would reunite, and that the Sunshine Policy, where the North Koreans were trying to open up trade and travel between the two countries, was a real big worry in its own right, because America doesn't want North Korea's nuclear capacity in the hands of South Korea's economically powerful country that would basically create a new power in East Asia for them to have to deal with. And so that they've been deliberately thwarting any kind of progress that they can toward reunification. What do you think about that?
Well, two things. The first one is that if it's conceivable that somebody has finally gotten to our illustrious decider or leader and said, we haven't got the troops or anything else that we need in the Persian Gulf, where we have all these vital interests, oil and all that sort of thing. We haven't got the troops for your surge or anything else. The problem is we've got 35,000 combat troops sitting there on their duff in South Korea, and God knows how much support activity going on there. And we're building a permanent base there right now, a new one for those people. And we don't have any strategic interest anymore, if we ever did, in the Korean situation. When Clinton negotiated that 1994 agreed framework, China and Russia were, this was 1994, 1993, their situation with vis-a-vis us and the rest of the world was very different than it is this time around, okay? And it's conceivable in those days that we thought 35,000 troops in South Korea could somehow or another offset China and Russia. Well, that ain't the case now. And those 35,000 combat troops and all the probably hundreds of thousands of supporting Air Force and Navy forces are just, they're just, on vacation practically. So that, if Bush really wants to start a war with Iran, then the thing to do, obviously, is to get those troops out of there and get them to the Persian Gulf, where they can do, in his view, some good. I hope that's not something that comes to pass, and it would take years for it to happen. But the agreement, as I understand it, from what I've read in Russian journals, that is English versions of Russian journals, and I sent you a copy of one of them, is that not only has the United States capitulated on a lot of other things that we have been threatening the North Koreans with, but we even agreed to unfreeze the bank in Macau that we claimed was laundering counterfeit money and all that sort of thing. I mean, this is a complete capitulation that appears on the surface by the Bush administration. And you ask yourself, well, why would they do such a thing like that? And I hate to say it, but I think one of the reasons would be, we don't have any strategic interest there anymore in the Korean Peninsula, and we got a huge fraction of our armed forces tied up there, and why not get them out and so we can move them somewhere where they'll do some good?
Yeah, some good. Depends on whose perspective, I guess.
Well,
which brings
know what
us.
I mean.
Yes, I do. And that brings us back to Iran, and I'd like to ask you briefly about an article that you wrote, I guess about a year ago or something, about nuclear bunker busters. And if I read that article right, what you were saying was there's really no such thing as a nuclear bunker buster. If you have an earth-penetrating missile, that is a supersonic missile, and you can't put a nuclear warhead on it. If you have a nuclear missile, it's ballistic, meaning it's, you shoot it up, but then you let it fall on its target, and therefore it's not supersonic, and that it's one or the other, but never both. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, that's pretty close. I should say that I was not in the Navy. I was in the Naval Reserve when I was in the U.S. Navy in the nuclear weapons business, and then I was in the Naval Reserve when I was at the Lawrence Livermore Lab in the bomb testing business, and at Sandia National Laboratory. By then, I'd resigned my commission, but in all three of those capacities, in the Navy, in the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, at Lawrence Livermore, and at Sandia National Laboratory, there was a considerable effort to try to make nuclear weapons that you could put on an earth penetrator or something like a long rod penetrator or something like that, and get it survivable, because just having a nuclear explosive doesn't mean that you're going to be able to knock out something that's buried deep underground. The nuclear weapons that we had for that purpose, what they were intended to do was to knock out hardened silos, but the silo opening obviously is at ground level or very close to it. There's a concrete or thick concrete door on the top of it that slides back, but basically, the problem of penetrating deep in the earth is not made any easier if you've got a nuclear weapon involved. The basic thing that you need to know about nuclear weapons is when detonated at ground level, not at an optimum height of burst or something like that, is it's basically it's an explosive. A 10 kiloton nuclear weapon, when set off at ground level, is basically the equivalent of, as you might expect, 10 kilotons of high explosives set off there. Most of the energy goes into blast.
Right, and I guess we all know from the pictures of all the nuclear explosions we've seen, a lot of that energy just goes straight up the path of least resistance, I guess.
Oh, sure, yeah. And
so the point being here that if, as it's been reported, back and forth, that the nuclear option, quote unquote, is on the table for use against Iran's pretend nuclear weapons, the idea that we might use real ones. The basis for that has been particularly the Natanz facility, which is buried deep underground, as you say.
Which is, as of today, I believe, still empty.
Yeah, well, that's the immediate threat that we need to take out there, that empty warehouse there.
Yeah, it's underground and it's deep down there, but if they have started installing centrifuges in there, it's just been in the last few weeks.
Yeah, and they're still no closer to a nuclear weapon than they have been for quite some time, it seems.
Well, that's assuming that they had a nuclear weapons program. And there was no evidence that Iraq had reconstituted its failed attempt to construct nuclear weapons when we invaded Iraq in 2003. There was no evidence that the North Koreans had attempted to make nuclear weapons up until we abrogated the agreed framework in October of 2002. And there's no evidence even yet that Iran is attempting to make nuclear weapons. The IAEA has just had almost the free run of that place. I know you've interviewed or you've talked to Scott Ritter, but in his latest book and in also the public conference, or what would you call it, question and answer session that he and Cy Hirsch held here, I think it was in November or December of last year. He said that it was just amazing to him. He had spent 7 years as a UN inspector in Iraq, after the war, from 1991 through 98. And so he knew what a country was like that was a dictatorship kind of thing. And he was expecting the same thing when he went to Iran last summer, I guess it was, just before his book came out. And he said it was incredible to him. When he got there, it was almost like being in this country. He got to go anywhere he wanted to and to talk to anybody he wanted to. It was just amazing. He said he just couldn't believe it. And I don't know if he actually saw that empty warehouse, underground warehouse at Natanz, but he said over and over again that he had been in constant contact all these years with Israeli intelligence at the worker bee level, the analysts and the people who were actually on the ground and spying and all that sort of thing. And what he said was, not only has the IAEA been able to find any indication in Iran of a nuclear weapons program, but Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, has been unable to find any evidence whatsoever of a Iranian nuclear weapons program.
Well, he also said there that day, didn't he, that the Israeli point of view is that for Iran to have any nuclear capability whatsoever is quote-unquote tantamount to their ability to produce a nuclear weapon. That's how low their threshold is. So it's not even really a secret program they're referring to. It's the open one.
The media we talked about earlier, they all, when they write those kinds of things up, they somehow or another imply that when the people talk about Iran's nuclear ambitions, that they're talking about nuclear weapons. You know, and so they'll then say a bunch of things that are true about Iran's nuclear program, but they want you then to assume that what they're really talking about is a nuclear weapons program, and it's not. There's, you know, and as I remember Scott's particular statement, there ain't nothing there. You remember that?
Right. These are the secret facilities we can't find because they don't exist.
I don't know. Well, at any rate, here we got these journalists at the New York Times. Judith Miller's not there anymore, but there's plenty more where she came from.
Yeah, sure does seem that way, too.
Who just report uncritically, as if it was God's truth revealed to George Bush one night, that they had these programs.
Yeah,
no evidence, none at all. No, go back to what it is. This capitulation by the United States, and it's obvious to the rest of the world that it is a capitulation. And of course, you know, John Bolton is just beside himself.
Right, he said yesterday that he hopes that North Korea breaks the deal, and so that we can, I guess, have more excuse to threaten them.
Well, if he was around, of course, he would accuse them of having broken it, whether it was or not. And let's just take, for example, if the Chinese and the Russians weren't involved, you can almost see what would happen in a relatively short period of time. The North Koreans would say, okay, here they are. Here are all our nuclear sites. And here even is the plutonium that we've recovered from the reactor fuel, spent fuel, which we did as a result of you unilaterally breaking the agreed framework and freezing all our people in the dark. We would then say, wait a minute, these are not all your facilities. Where is the uranium enrichment nuclear weapon program? And the Koreans would have to say,
right.
We've tried to tell you now for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years at a minimum. We had Sig Hecker, who is the former director of Los Alamos National Lab over here. We took him around. We showed him everything we've got, including the plutonium that we've recovered from the spent fuel. This was in January of 2004, as I recall. And Sig Hecker came back and he reported to Congress, a very extensive report. And he says, well, what about your uranium enrichment programs? And this guy who was a minister in the government, he was showing him their plutonium, proudly showing him their separated plutonium that had been alloyed with gadolinium or something so as to make it machinable. And Sig is a metallurgist, and he understood perfectly what it was that the North Koreans had done, and it was significant, but it was a long way from having a nuclear weapon. Well, at any rate, he says, well, what about all these this uranium enrichment based nuclear weapons program? The guy says, we don't have. Here's the plutonium we have that we intend to make nuclear weapons with. And you ask us about some uranium enrichment based nuclear weapons program? We don't have such a program. We don't have anybody working on it.
And it seems like they'd have gone ahead and admitted it at that point.
Sure,
right?
Why not?
Yeah, why not?
If you were really I'm not an Oriental, so I don't know how they think, but I would have at least said, well, no, you can't see that, or
yeah, something.
Or, well, that's for us to know, and you'll wonder about. But they've been consistent from day one, from the very day that some American diplomat said that a North Korean admitted to him at a cocktail party that they did have such a program. the very next day and from then on, they bitterly denied it, you know?
Yeah,
they
and
don't have such a program.
This guy at the dinner party, was his code name Curveball by any chance?
So this guy probably was stood up against the wall and shot if he really did say something like that or something like that.
Yeah, or more likely he was a figment of this guy's imagination.
Well, there was also a thing, Scott, wherein when there was doubt expressed by all of these officials, he said, well, there were some Russian and Chinese that were within earshot at this cocktail party, and they heard it. And then I saw a report almost immediately by the Russians and the Chinese denying that they had heard any such thing. You know, well, anyway, but now the good thing, as I see it, about this agreed framework is it is now going to involve the Russians and the Chinese, and they're orders of magnitude more powerful and more influential and more interested in what happens on the Korean Peninsula than they were back in 1994. And, you know, now I saw in, I think it was Sanger's article, it might have been Kessler's, I don't remember, where Bush Jr. is claiming credit for the North Korean capitulation because he claims that he told the Chinese president, look, this is your problem. And, you know, you need to solve it. You, the Chinese, need to solve this problem. Well, that's absolutely true. We're not a player anymore, except for those 35,000 combat troops and God knows how many supporting personnel and ships and things of that nature that we've got there. But it's not us anymore, you know.
Right. Absolutely true, except for who capitulated to who.
Well,
yeah.
I don't think there's any... I have not seen the agreement yet, but on the basis of the reports that I've seen, including even the one that's at the Korean website, you know, that's their official propaganda site and all that sort of thing, they don't claim it was a capitulation. But the Russian, some other people are claiming that it is a capitulation by the United States.
Well, just on its face, they had a deal, and Bush broke it, and now Bush has given them more or less the very same deal back again, and they've lost
even
nothing.
Better, I think, Scott, because this time around and I want to stress this.
Right.
The Chinese and the Russians are orders of magnitude more powerful in the world now than they were when that agreement was originally written. 1994, and it is in their interest, and they're going to see to it that North Korea and us comply with our end of this thing, you know?
Right. Yeah, that is definitely hopeful. Well, congratulations to whichever State Department flunkies were able to put this thing together then. All right,
yeah, well, I don't know. I hope Bolton doesn't, I don't know.
Yeah, right. He's gone for now.
Maybe he'll set himself on fire, do you think?
Yeah, well, burn himself in effigy or something. All right, thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
All right, everybody, Dr. Gordon Prather, he writes regularly for antiwar.com. You can read his archives, antiwar.com/Prather. He's there every weekend, Saturday and Sunday. Spent his entire life making nuclear bombs and knows all about them and the treaties that describe them.
I spent almost as much time in the non-Lugar-Domenici denuclearization, the peaceful disposition of Russian nuclear weapons, too.
Ah, there you go. So he spent half his life building them and half his life taking them apart.
That's about right.
And he knows all about the international agreements and the negotiations, so you don't have to believe Sanger and the neo-crazy media sycophants at the New York Times and the Washington Post. You can go to antiwar.com/Prather to find out the straight dope, what's really going on with this stuff.
There you go.
All right. Thank you, Gordon.
Bye.